A gunshot echoes through a dusty Texas town in 1879, where law bends to the will of the strong. Jacob Harland, a war-scarred rancher haunted by loss, steps into a cattle auction, his heart as barren as his land. A single glance from a silent girl, bound and misunderstood, stirs memories he buried deep. Her eyes hold no plea, only a quiet strength that promises to unravel his solitude. Will their shared silence forge a bond to defy a town's wrath and a past that hunts them? Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover how their story rewrites fate. What secrets does her silence hide? Stay to find out. The sun hung low over the Texas horizon in 1879, painting the sky a bruised orange as dust swirled through the air of a ramshackle frontier town. The auction yard smelled of sweat, manure, and desperation, its wooden pens creaking under the weight of restless cattle. Men in weathered hats and boots, caked with red dirt, crowded the splintered fence, their voices a low rumble of barter and bravado. This was a place where law was a whisper, drowned out by the clink of spurs and the crack of a revolver's hammer. Jacob Harland stood at the edge of the throng, his lean frame half hidden in the shadow of a sagging barn. His eyes, gray as gunmetal, scanned the pens with a quiet intensity. A former Union soldier, he'd traded bayonets for plowshares, though the war's scars clung to him like burrs. His wife and son were gone, taken in a blaze of fire and blood by Mexican raiders years ago. Now, he was a man of few words, his small ranch a brittle refuge from a world that had chewed him up and spat him out. He'd come for a mule, nothing more, something stubborn enough to till his rocky soil. The auctioneer, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, barked from a makeshift platform. Next lot. One mule, limpin' but loyal. Who'll start at $5? Jacob raised a hand, his calloused fingers steady. The crowd barely noticed. Their eyes were on the cattle, the real prize of the day. But the air shifted when a drunken bellow cut through the din. Hold your bids! A lout with a sweat-stained shirt and a crooked grin staggered forward, dragging a rope. At its end was no beast, but a girl, barefoot, her dress torn, her dark hair a tangled mess spilling over her shoulders. She was young, maybe 18, her wrists bound with coarse hemp that bit into her skin. The crowd stilled, then erupted in jeers. "What's this, Amos?" one man hollered. "Selling your kin now?" Amos, swaying like a wind-bent sapling, spat into the dirt. "This here's Nora, C-mute, deaf, useless except for work. She'll scrub, haul, whatever you need. Start at 2 bits. The men laughed, their voices sharp as spurs, tossing crude jibes about what a useless girl might be good for. Jacob's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough of the world's cruelty to know where this was headed. He turned to leave, his boots scuffing the dry earth. But then he felt it. A gaze, heavy as a hand on his shoulder. He looked back. The girl, Nora, stood still amid the chaos, her eyes locked on his. They weren't pleading, weren't wet with tears. They were steady, piercing, like a hawk's stare before it dives. In that moment, Jacob saw something that stopped him cold. A void, not unlike his own, but lit with a quiet fire that refused to be snuffed out. His mind flashed to his son, to the night flames swallowed his world, to the screams he couldn't outrun. His hand clenched, nails biting into his palm. He didn't owe her anything. He didn't owe anyone. But those eyes, they saw him, saw the hollow where his heart used to be. Before he could think, his voice cut through the noise. $3 for the girl and the mule. The crowd fell silent, save for a few snickers. Amos blinked, then grinned, shoving Nora forward. "Sold to the quiet man," he slurred, pocketing the coins Jacob tossed into the dust. The girl didn't flinch as Jacob untied her wrists, the rope falling like shed snakeskin. She stood, unbowed, her gaze never leaving him. He didn't speak. Words felt useless under that stare. He led her and the limping mule out of the yard, past the gawking men, toward the long road to his ranch. The sun dipped lower, casting its shadows long and lean across the cracked earth. Jacob didn't know it yet, but he'd just bought more than a worker or a beast of burden. He'd bought a reckoning, one that would crack open his silence and force him to face the ghosts he'd buried. As they walked, Nora's bare feet left faint prints in the dust, each step steady, deliberate. She didn't look back at the town, didn't glance at the jeering voices fading behind. Jacob stole a glance at her, wondering what kind of soul could burn so bright in a world so eager to douse it. The wind carried a faint howl, like a warning of storms to come. The wind carried a faint howl, like a warning of storms to come. Jacob felt it whip across his face as he led Nora and the limping mule down the rutted trail toward his ranch, the town's jeers fading into the dusk. The girl's bare feet moved steadily as a metronome, leaving shallow prints in the parched earth. She hadn't spoken, hadn't flinched, and that silence gnawed at Jacob. It wasn't fear or weakness. It was something deeper, like a river running beneath stone. He glanced at her, her shadow stretching long beside his, and wondered what kind of weight could forge a gaze like hers. The ranch came into view, a squat cluster of weathered boards and a sagging corral under a sky now bleeding purple. Jacob tethered the mule, its uneven gait kicking up dust, and gestured toward the small cabin. "In there," he said, voice rough as gravel. Nora's eyes flicked to his, then to the door, and she stepped inside without hesitation. The interior was sparse, a table scarred from years of use, a single chair, a cot against the wall. A tin coffee pot sat cold on the hearth. Jacob watched her take it in, her gaze sharp, cataloging every detail like a scout before a raid. He expected questions, demands, even tears, something to break the quiet. But Nora only moved to the hearth, knelt, and began stacking kindling with a precision that spoke of habit. Her hands, though bruised from the rope, were steady, coaxing a spark into flame within minutes. The firelight danced across her face, catching the faint scar above her brow. Jacob stood frozen, the weight of her presence filling the room like smoke. He'd brought her here on impulse, driven by that damn look in her eyes. But now what? He wasn't a savior. He was barely a man. "Name's Jacob," he said, breaking the silence. "You'll work here. Food, shelter, that's the deal." Her head tilted, eyes meeting his again, and for a moment he thought she might speak. But she only nodded, then turned back to the fire. He cursed under his breath. What was he doing, dragging a stranger into his life? His ranch was no place for softness, and this girl, Nora, was a complication he didn't need. The next morning, dawn broke sharp and cold, the air heavy with the promise of frost. Jacob found Nora already outside, hauling water from the creek with a bucket he hadn't touched in months. She moved like she'd mapped the land in her sleep, her steps sure, despite the uneven ground. He watched her pour the water into a trough for the mule, her hands steady even as the wind tugged at her tattered dress. There was no clumsiness, no hesitation. She worked like she'd been born to it, like the land itself whispered instructions only she could hear. By noon, she'd cleaned the corral, fed the scrawny chickens, and patched a hole in the fence with a piece of wire she'd found God knows where. Jacob, mending a plow, kept stealing glances. She didn't pause for praise or direction, just moved from task to task, her silence louder than any words. It unsettled him. He'd known men who worked hard, but this was different. It was as if she saw the ranch's needs before they even arose. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Nora stood at the edge of the corral, staring west. The sky was a riot of red and gold, but her face was still, almost expectant. Jacob followed her gaze, seeing nothing but the horizon. "Storm's comin'," he muttered, more to himself. But Nora was already moving, herding the chickens into their coop with a gentle nudge of her foot. He frowned. The air was calm, the clouds distant. Yet, by nightfall, thunder rumbled, and rain lashed the cabin's roof. She'd known. He sat by the fire, the storm's howl rattling the shutters. Nora, across from him, mended a torn shirt with a needle he didn't even know he owned. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his, and there it was again. That look, like she saw straight through his bones to the grief he'd buried. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, like she knew the shape of loss as well as he did. His throat tightened, memories of his son's laughter flickering like the firelight. He looked away, but the weight of her gaze lingered. Jacob didn't sleep that night. The storm passed, but another was brewing. Inside him, inside this quiet girl who seemed to hear what no one else could. He didn't know her story, didn't know if he wanted to, but as the fire died to embers, he felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around himself. Nora wasn't just a worker. She was a mirror, reflecting a man he'd forgotten how to be. Nora wasn't just a worker. She was a mirror, reflecting a man he'd forgotten how to be. Jacob lay awake as the embers dimmed, the cabin's silence now a weight he couldn't shake. Her presence, quiet as a shadow, stirred something in him. Questions, doubts, a flicker of dread. He didn't know what she was, but she wasn't what the town claimed. By dawn, he'd made up his mind to watch her closer, to understand the riddle of her silence. The Texas sun rose like a furnace, baking the cracked earth of Jacob's ranch in the summer of 1879. Dust hung in the air, coating everything in a gritty haze. Nora was already at work, her silhouette sharp against the horizon, as she led the mule to a patch of stubborn soil. Jacob followed, his boots crunching on the dry ground, his eyes narrowed against the glare. She moved with purpose, guiding the mule to drag a rusty plow through the dirt. Her hands, still marked from the auction's ropes, gripped the reins with a sureness that belied her slight frame. He set to work nearby, sharpening a scythe, but his attention stayed on her. She didn't falter, didn't tire, even as the heat pressed down like a heavy hand. Then, mid-morning, she stopped. Her head tilted, as if catching a sound no one else could hear. She dropped the reins and walked to the corral, where a scrawny calf was tangled in a loose fence wire. Jacob hadn't noticed it, but Nora knelt, her fingers deftly freeing the animal before it could thrash itself bloody. The calf bolted, and she stood, brushing dirt from her hands, her eyes scanning the horizon again. Jacob's grip tightened on the scythe. "How'd you know?" he asked, voice low. She didn't turn, didn't answer, just resumed her work. But he saw it, a faint shift in her posture, like she'd heard him in some other way. It wasn't the first time. Days earlier, she'd moved the chickens before the storm hit. Now, this. He'd lived on this land long enough to know its rhythms, but Nora seemed to feel its pulse. By afternoon, the air grew thick, heavy with the threat of something more than heat. Jacob was checking the water trough when Nora appeared, carrying a bundle of dried herbs tied with twine. She pointed to a cow in the far pen, its sides heaving, eyes rolling. "She's in trouble," Jacob muttered, recognizing the signs of a difficult birth. But Nora was already moving, fetching a bucket of water from the creek and setting it to warm over a fire she'd built in minutes. She crushed the herbs, mixing them into the water with a practiced hand, then approached the cow with a calm that stilled its thrashing. Jacob watched, half expecting her to fail. He'd seen men lose livestock to births like this, but Nora's hands moved with a quiet certainty. She guided the calf out, slick and trembling, and cleared its nose before it could choke. The cow lowed, exhausted but alive, and the calf wobbled to its feet. Nora stepped back, her face unreadable, but her eyes held that same piercing clarity. Jacob's breath caught. He hadn't told her the cow was struggling. He hadn't even known until she pointed it out. That night, under a sky pricked with stars, Jacob sat on the porch, a tin cup of coffee gone cold in his hand. Nora was inside, mending a torn saddle by lamplight. He'd stopped asking her questions. She didn't answer, not with words. But her actions spoke louder. She didn't just work, she anticipated. The land, the animals, the air itself seemed to confide in her, revealing secrets it hid from him. He'd once thought her silence was emptiness, but now he saw it as something else, a language he couldn't yet read. The next day brought another sign. A hawk circled low, its shadow slicing across the ranch. Nora paused, her eyes following it, then walked to the creek's edge. Jacob trailed her, curious. She pointed to a patch of mud where a snake lay coiled, its rattle stilled by a broken spine. "Must have been the hawk," he said, but Nora shook her head, her finger tracing the air toward the hills. He squinted, seeing nothing but scrub and stone. Hours later, a faint tremor shook the ground, a rare quake, small, but enough to spook the mule. She'd known. Again. Jacob's unease grew. Nora wasn't deaf, wasn't mute, not in any way that mattered. She heard things, felt them, in a way that made his skin prickle. Was it instinct, or something more? The town's whispers about witches and devils echoed in his mind, but he pushed them away. He'd seen enough of men's cruelty to doubt their tales. Still, Nora was a mystery, and mysteries in this land often came with a price. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ranch, Jacob felt the weight of her gaze again, pulling him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ranch, Jacob felt the weight of Nora's gaze again, pulling him toward a truth he wasn't ready to face. The Texas night settled like a heavy blanket, thick with the hum of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Jacob stood on the porch, his silhouette a lone sentinel against the star-pricked sky. Nora's abilities, her uncanny knack for sensing what lay beyond sight, gnawed at him. She was no ordinary girl, and that knowledge stirred a restless unease. The town, with its sharp tongues and sharper suspicions, wouldn't stay quiet for long. By morning, the air carried a new edge, like the faint tang of smoke before a fire. Jacob rode into town for supplies, leaving Nora to tend the ranch. The general store was a cramped den of barrels and sacks, its air thick with the scent of tobacco and leather. Men lounged against the counter, their voices low but barbed. "That girl at Harland's place," one muttered, spitting tobacco juice into a tin. "Heard she stopped a calf from dying. Ain't natural, knowing things like that." Another, a grizzled trapper with a scar across his cheek, leaned in. "Folks say she's a witch, hearing the devil's whispers." Jacob's hand paused over a sack of flour, his jaw tight. He paid and left, the weight of their words trailing him like dust. Back at the ranch, Nora was splitting wood, her movements precise, the axe biting clean into the logs. She didn't look up as Jacob approached, but he felt her awareness, like a hawk sensing movement in the brush. He didn't mention the town's talk, didn't know how. Instead, he watched her work, the rhythm of her swings steady as a heartbeat. But the piece was brittle. That afternoon, a neighbor, Old Man Carver, rode up, his face creased with worry. His grandson, a boy of 6, was burning with fever, thrashing in delirium. "Heard your girls got away with sickness," Carver said, voice low, almost ashamed. Jacob hesitated, then nodded to Nora. She gathered herbs from a small patch she'd started near the creek, her fingers quick as she tied them into a bundle. At Carver's cabin, the boy lay pale, his breath ragged. Nora worked in silence, brewing a tea that smelled of earth and bitter roots. She held the cup to the boy's lips, her touch gentle but sure. Hours later, the fever broke, and the boy's eyes fluttered open. Carver wept, clutching Nora's hand, but his wife stood in the corner, her gaze narrow, lips pressed thin. "Ain't right," she whispered as they left. "No one heals that fast." Word spread like wildfire through dry grass. By week's end, the town buzzed with tales of Nora's witchcraft. At the saloon, men swapped stories over whiskey, their voices thick with fear and scorn. "She doesn't talk, doesn't hear, but knows when death's comin'," one said. "Mark my words, she's cursed." A woman at the church social claimed Nora had hexed the boy to prove her power. Jacob heard it all when he went to fetch nails, the whispers cutting sharper than a blade. He wanted to shout them down, to tell them Nora was no witch, just a girl with a gift. But he stayed silent, his fists clenched, knowing truth rarely outran fear in a place like this. If you're caught up in this tale, folks, do us a favor. Subscribe to keep it rollin'. Share where you're listening from. It's mighty fine to know who's riding along with us. Your support keeps these stories alive, like a fire that doesn't quit. Now, back to the ranch, where trouble was brewing faster than a summer storm. Nora seemed untouched by the rumors, her days filled with work, mending fences, tending the mule, planting seeds in soil that fought every effort. But Jacob saw the shift in her eyes, a flicker of caution when a rider passed too close. One evening, as they sat by the fire, a stone crashed through the cabin's window, shattering glass across the floor. Nora froze, her gaze darting to the darkness outside. Jacob grabbed his rifle, stepping onto the porch, but the night was empty, save for the echo of hoofbeats fading into the hills. He turned back to find Nora sweeping the glass, her hands steady but her eyes hard, like she'd expected this. The town's fear was a noose tightening around them. Jacob knew it wasn't just talk. Fear bred action, and action in these parts meant blood. Nora's gift, whatever it was, had painted a target on her back. As he watched her stack the broken glass, her silence louder than the stone's impact, Jacob felt a storm gathering. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of men who'd come for her soon. Jacob felt a storm gathering. Not in the sky, but in the hearts of men who'd come for her soon. The shattered glass Nora swept that night lay in a neat pile by the cabin door, a silent testament to the town's growing malice. Jacob stood watch until dawn, rifle across his knees, the weight of her safety settling like lead in his chest. The Texas morning broke harsh in 1879, the sun a merciless eye glaring over the scrubland. Nora worked as always, her hands steady as she fed the mule, but her eyes flicked to the horizon more often, as if she sensed the trouble brewing beyond the hills. Midday brought a rider. The hoofbeats were heavy, deliberate, kicking up clouds of dust that hung like a warning. Jacob stepped onto the porch, hand resting on the pistol at his hip. The man dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved hard by years of violence. A scar snaked from his jaw to his temple, and his eyes, cold as a snake's, locked on Jacob. Clay Dobbs. The name hit Jacob like a bullet, dragging up memories of fire, screams, and the night his family burned. Clay had led the raiders then, a mercenary with no code, but greed. "Harland," Clay drawled, spitting into the dirt. "Heard you took in a stray. Town's talkin'." His voice was smooth as oil, but the threat beneath it was sharp. Nora stood by the corral, her gaze fixed on Clay, unyielding. Jacob's fingers twitched, itching for the trigger. "What's your business here?" he said, voice low, steady as stone. Clay smirked, stepping closer, his spurs jangling like a rattlesnake's warning. "Your daddy's land, Jacob. Stole it from the Comanche, didn't he? I'm here to claim what's owed. And that girl, she's worth more than your dirt patch." Jacob's blood ran cold. Clay's words weren't just about land. He'd heard rumors of men like Clay trading people like cattle, turning lives into coin. Nora wasn't just a worker to him. She was a prize, a way to line his pockets. Jacob stepped forward, closing the distance. "You're on my land now. Leave." Clay's laugh was a dry rasp, like wind over bones. "You think you can keep her? The town's already calling her a witch. They'll burn her, and you with her, unless you hand her over." Nora moved then, silent as a shadow, placing herself between the men. Her eyes bored into Clay, not with fear, but with a defiance that made him pause. For a moment, the air crackled, heavy with unspoken challenges. Clay broke the silence, his grin twisting. "Got spirit, don't she? Shame it's wasted on you, Harland." He mounted his horse, but his parting words hung like a noose. "I'll be back, and I ain't coming alone." The days that followed were taut as a bowstring. Jacob fortified the ranch, checking fences, oiling his rifle, his eyes scanning the hills for signs of Clay's return. Nora worked alongside him, her silence a steady presence, but he caught her pausing at odd moments, staring at the sky, the ground, as if listening to something he couldn't hear. One evening, she carved a symbol into the dirt near the cabin, a looping shape like a river's bend. Jacob frowned, asking, "What's that?" She didn't answer, just covered it with her foot, her gaze distant. The town's whispers grew louder, carried by travelers and traders. A preacher in a black coat rode through, calling Nora the Devil's Ear, stirring the townsfolk into a frenzy. Jacob heard it at the feed store, where men no longer met his eyes. "She's trouble, Harland," one muttered. "Best cut her loose." But Jacob saw Nora's hands, steady as she stitched a wound on the mule's flank, her focus unbroken by the world's venom. He couldn't abandon her, not when she'd already survived so much. One night, a fire glowed on the distant ridge, a signal, Jacob knew, of men gathering. Clay was rallying his crew, likely promising them land, gold, or Nora herself. Jacob stood by the corral, the weight of his past pressing down. Clay wasn't just a man, he was a ghost, dragging Jacob back to the night his world burned. Nora joined him, her presence quiet but solid, her eyes scanning the same ridge. She touched his arm, brief as a breath, and pointed to the fire. Jacob nodded, understanding. Clay was coming, and with him, a reckoning. The ranch, once a refuge, was now a battleground, and Nora's strange gifts might be the only thing keeping them alive. The ranch, once a refuge, was now a battleground, and Nora's strange gifts might be the only thing keeping them alive. Jacob stood by the corral. The distant fire on the ridge burned into his mind like a brand. The night air of Texas in 1879 was thick, heavy with the scent of sage and the promise of violence. Nora's touch on his arm lingered, her silent warning as clear as a shouted alarm. Clay Dobbs was coming, and the town's fear would be his weapon. Jacob checked his rifle, the metal cold under his calloused fingers, and waited for dawn. Morning broke with a sky the color of ash, clouds rolling in like a gathering mob. By noon, hoofbeats thundered down the trail, not one rider, but a dozen, their shadows long and menacing. Clay led them, his scar glinting in the gray light, a preacher in black at his side. The townsfolk followed, men with rifles, women clutching shawls, their faces twisted with fear and righteous fury. They stopped at the ranch's edge, a wall of bodies under the sagging oak. Clay's voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. "Harland, bring out the witch. Time for justice." Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, Nora behind him. Her eyes were steady, her bare feet planted firm on the warped boards. The crowd murmured, their torches flickering like angry stars. The preacher, his voice a venomous drawl, raised a tattered Bible. "This girl's the devil's ear. She hears what no Christian should, works curses in the dark," a woman shouted. "She hexed my boy, then played savior." Jacob's grip tightened, his voice low but carrying. "She saved your boy. You know it." Clay dismounted, his spurs jangling, and strode forward. "Town's decided, Harland. Hand her over, or we burn this place to ash." The crowd roared, their voices a wave of hate. Jacob scanned their faces, men he'd shared whiskey with, women he'd nodded to at church. Fear had turned them into strangers. He raised his rifle, not aiming but ready. "Ain't no witch here, just a girl. You want her? You'll go through me." The preacher stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with zeal. "God demands a trial. Bring her to the square. Let the truth show." The crowd surged, chanting for blood. Jacob's heart pounded, his past flashing. Flames, screams, his son's small hand slipping from his. He couldn't lose again. But Nora touched his shoulder, her gaze calm, resolute. She nodded toward the crowd as if to say, "Let them come." Against his every instinct, Jacob lowered his rifle. "We'll go," he said, voice hard. "But no one touches her." The town square was a dirt-packed arena, ringed by faces lit by torchlight. Nora stood in the center, hands unbound, her tattered dress swaying in the evening breeze. Clay paced like a coyote, his words venomous. "She's the devil's tool. Cast her out, or we all pay." The crowd roared, but a woman, Carver's wife, the grandmother of the boy Nora saved, stepped forward, trembling. Her eyes met Nora's, and something broke. Nora moved to her, slow, deliberate, and placed a hand on her chest. The gesture was simple, silent, but it carried a weight that silenced the mob. The woman's face crumpled, tears spilling. "She saved my grandson," she whispered, loud enough for all to hear. "I lied. I was scared, but she ain't no witch." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, doubt cracking their resolve. A man lowered his torch, and another stepped back. Clay's face twisted, his hand twitching toward his gun. "Lies!" he bellowed. "She's got you all fooled." But the air had shifted, the mob's certainty wavering under Nora's unflinching gaze. Jacob stood at her side, his rifle ready, watching Clay's every move. The preacher shouted scripture, but his voice faltered as more townsfolk wavered. A girl, no older than 10, broke from the crowd, clutching Nora's hand. "She taught me to find water in the creek," she said, voice small but clear. The crowd stilled, the weight of truth settling like dust after a stampede. Nora's silence spoke louder than Clay's lies, her presence a challenge to their fear. But Clay wasn't done. His eyes burned with a desperate rage, his hand hovering over his holster. Jacob saw it, the glint of steel, the tightening of his jaw. The square was a powder keg, and Clay was the spark. Nora's hand tightened on the girl's, her eyes locked on Jacob, as if she knew what was coming. The wind died, the torches flickered, and the world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The wind died, the torches flickered, and the world held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The town square of Texas in 1879 stood frozen, a cauldron of fear and fury under a sky heavy with clouds. Jacob's hand gripped his rifle, his eyes locked on Clay Dobbs, whose fingers twitched above his holster. Nora stood beside the young girl, her gaze steady, her silence a defiance that cut through the mob's fading chants. The air was taut, like a rope stretched to snapping. One move, one spark, and blood would spill. Clay's lips curled into a snarl, his scar twisting like a snake in the torchlight. "You've bewitched 'em all, girl," he roared, his hand flashing to his gun. The crowd gasped, scattering as the steel gleamed. Jacob moved faster, his rifle snapping up, but Clay's shot rang out first. Pain seared through Jacob's shoulder, a hot blade tearing flesh. He staggered, blood soaking his shirt, but his aim held. His finger squeezed the trigger, and the crack of his rifle split the night. Clay lurched, a red bloom spreading across his chest, his eyes wide with shock. He crumpled to the dirt, his gun clattering beside him. Chaos erupted. The crowd screamed, some fleeing, others frozen, their torches dropping to the ground. The preacher's Bible fell, pages fluttering like wounded birds. Jacob sank to one knee, his vision blurring, the rifle slipping from his grip. The square spun, the world tilting. But Nora was there, her hands on his shoulders, her face a beacon in the haze. She dragged him back, her strength belying her slight frame, pulling him toward the edge of the square as flames from a fallen torch licked at a nearby wagon. The mob scattered, their righteous fury dissolving into panic. A few men shouted for order, but the fight had gone out of them. Clay's body lay still, a dark heap in the dust. His threat ended, but the cost heavy. Nora's hands pressed against Jacob's wound, her fingers slick with blood as she tore a strip from her dress to bind it. Her eyes, fierce and focused, held no trace of fear. Jacob tried to speak, his voice a rasp, but she shook her head, her touch steady, grounding him against the pain. Then, a sound, a low, broken whisper, barely audible over the crackle of flames. "Don't leave me," Nora said, her voice raw, like gravel scraped from a dry creek bed. Jacob's breath caught. It was the first time she'd spoken, and the words hit him harder than the bullet. He gripped her hand, his vision swimming, but his resolve iron. "Ain't going nowhere," he managed, though the world was fading. Nora pulled him to his feet, half carrying him toward the ranch as the town burned behind them. The wagon's flames spread, catching a nearby shed, the fire a hungry beast devouring the square. The townsfolk's shouts faded, their fear of Nora now mixed with awe. She'd faced their wrath, turned their hearts, and now saved the man who'd stood for her. Jacob leaned on her, each step a battle, the pain in his shoulder a dull roar. The night was alive with chaos, but Nora moved like a shadow, her bare feet sure on the uneven trail. At the ranch, she laid him on the cot, her hands quick as she boiled water and fetched herbs from her stash. The cabin smelled of earth and blood, the firelight casting her shadow long across the walls. She worked in silence, cleaning the wound, stitching it with a needle and thread from a tin box. Jacob watched her, his mind foggy but clear enough to see her strength. She wasn't just saving him, she was fighting for them both, for a life carved from this hard land. As dawn broke, gray and heavy, the ranch stood quiet, the distant town still smoldering. Jacob's fever ebbed, his strength returning under Nora's care. He looked at her, sitting by the hearth, her face weary but unbowed. Her whisper echoed in his mind, a tether pulling him back from the edge. He'd lost everything once, but this time he'd fought and lived. Nora wasn't just a girl he'd saved. She was his reason to keep fighting. The town might never fully trust her, but they'd seen her truth. And Jacob, for the first time in years, felt the stir of something like hope, fragile but stubborn, like a seed in rocky soil. And Jacob, for the first time in years, felt the stir of something like hope, fragile but stubborn, like a seed in rocky soil. The Texas dawn of 1879 broke cold. The ranch bathed in a pale light that softened the scars of the night before. Jacob lay on the cot, his shoulder bandaged, the pain a dull pulse beneath Nora's careful stitches. She sat by the hearth, her silhouette sharp against the flickering flames, her silence no longer a mystery, but a language he was beginning to understand. The town's fire had burned out, but its judgment lingered, and Jacob knew their fight wasn't over. Winter came hard, the wind howling like a wounded beast across the plains. The ranch was a fortress of solitude, its fences patched, its animals sheltered, thanks to Nora's tireless hands. Jacob's strength returned slowly, each day a battle against the wound that had nearly claimed him. Nora was his anchor, her quiet presence a steady rhythm in the chaos of recovery. She taught him to read her movements, the way her eyes narrowed before a storm, the tilt of her head when a hawk's cry signaled danger. In return, he taught her to write, scratching letters in the dirt with a stick, her fingers tracing Nora, with a focus that made his chest ache. Their days fell into a pattern, a dance of survival carved from necessity. Nora planted seeds in the spring, her hands coaxing life from the stubborn earth. Jacob watched her, marveling at how she'd kneel by a sprout, her fingers brushing the soil as if listening to its secrets. She'd mark the ground with those strange symbols again, loops and curves that seemed to hold meaning only she understood. When he asked, she'd point to the sky or the creek, her eyes saying what her voice didn't. He stopped pressing, trusting her instincts as he once trusted his own. The town kept its distance, the memory of the shootout a raw wound. But whispers softened over time. A traitor brought news. The preacher had left, shamed by his own lies. Carver's wife, the grandmother, spoke of Nora's kindness at the general store, her voice carrying weight. Children began to appear at the ranch, drawn by tales of the quiet girl who could find water or save a sick calf. Nora welcomed them, showing them how to gentle a horse or spot a storm's approach in the wind's shift. Jacob watched from the porch, his rifle set aside, a faint smile tugging at his lips. One evening, as summer's heat gave way to a cool dusk, a boy lingered after the others left. He was small, his eyes wide with curiosity, clutching a stick horse he'd carved himself. Nora knelt beside him, guiding his hand to feel the ground's faint tremor, a sign of distant cattle moving. The boy laughed, his voice bright in the stillness. Jacob felt a pang, memories of his son flickering, but this time they didn't cut. Nora's gaze met his, and he saw it, her understanding, her shared loss, woven into the silence they'd built together. Years passed, the ranch growing stronger, its fields greener under Nora's care. The town's fear faded, replaced by a grudging respect. They called her the girl who hears with her heart, a name whispered with awe, not dread. Nora never spoke much, but her voice, when it came, was low and clear, reserved for moments that mattered. Jacob learned her signs, her glances, the way she'd point to a star or a blade of grass to share a truth. He taught her more words, and she taught him to listen, to the land, to the silence, to the pulse of life beneath it all. One night, under a sky blazing with stars, Jacob sat with Nora by the creek, the water's murmur a soft counterpoint to their quiet. He traced her name in the dirt, then his own beside it, a simple act that felt like a vow. She smiled, rare and fleeting, her hand brushing his. No words were needed. They'd forged a language of their own, built from trust and time, stronger than any spoken tongue. The ranch, once a grave for his past, was now a home, its earth alive with their shared survival. As the stars wheeled above, Jacob knew he'd been heard, not by words, but by the silent strength of the woman beside him. The tale of Jacob and Nora ends under a starlit Texas sky, their silent bond, a testament to resilience and understanding. What did their story stir in you? Did Nora's quiet strength or Jacob's redemption resonate most? Share your thoughts below. Your reflections keep these tales alive. We're grateful for your time, for riding this dusty trail with us, through the heart of 1879. Your presence makes every word matter. Until the next story calls, when we'll gather again by the firelight to uncover another chapter of the frontier, keep listening to the whispers of the wind. Farewell for now, and we'll meet again soon.